The arrow didn't kill him. That was what kept Chinjue awake most nights, staring into the darkness of his workshop, listening to the mountain wind howl through the bamboo groves. An ordinary arrow had pierced his left shoulder that autumn morning, passing clean through the soft tissue and bone. He should have died. Infection alone would have claimed him within weeks. But he didn't. Instead, he lived. He lived with burning pain that never fully subsided, with limited mobility in his throwing arm, and with a question that consumed every waking moment. Why did he survive when better men fell? It was the year 475 BCE in ancient China, during the tumultuous spring and autumn period, when warlords carved kingdoms from chaos and warfare wasn't a noble endeavour, it was survival. Qin Jue was 28 years old, and his entire life had been defined by weapons. His father had been a weaponsmith. His grandfather had been a weaponsmith. In the rigid hierarchy of Chinese society, Qin Jue's path had been predetermined before his first breath. He would work metal. He would craft implements of death. He would most likely die having never changed anything in the world. But the arrow changed that assumption. Before the injury, Qin Jue had been like any other skilled craftsman in his village of Shaoyang. He woke before dawn, worked his forge until dark, and surrendered his products to the garrison commander without question. Spears, swords, daggers, his weapons were competent and efficient. Soldiers carried them into battle. Some soldiers returned, others didn't. This was simply how the world worked. A man made tools. Those tools served their purpose. The craftsman didn't concern himself with the philosophical weight of that transaction. The arrow changed everything. He was delivering a shipment of spear blades to the garrison when the skirmish erupted. A rival warlord's scouts had penetrated closer to the settlement than anyone expected. What should have been a minor confrontation turned into sudden violence. Qin Jue, standing at the garrison gate, suddenly found himself in the middle of chaos horses screaming, men shouting, weapons clanging. An arrow came from nowhere, singing through the air like an angry wasp, and buried itself in his shoulder. He remembered falling. He remembered the weight of his own body suddenly being something he could no longer control. He remembered staring up at the blue autumn sky, thinking with surprising clarity, this is what death feels like at first: surprise, then distance, then nothing. But death didn't come. The garrison's physician, an old man named Chen Wei, who had learned his trade through 50 years of patching up broken soldiers, pulled the arrow out, packed the wound with a poultice of herbs and ash, and declared that Qin Jue would survive. "Your gods favour you," Chen Wei said, though there was no particular reverence in his voice. It was simply an observation, delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone he might have used to comment on the weather. Qin Jue spent 6 weeks recovering. During that time, something shifted inside his mind, or perhaps the pain shifted it, grinding new neural pathways through hours of fever and delirious nights. He began to think about the arrow in a way he'd never thought about weapons before. Not as an object to be manufactured and forgotten, but as a problem to be solved. The arrow had nearly killed him despite entering his body at an angle, despite striking him from perhaps 40 paces away, despite the fact that the archer was an untrained soldier rather than an expert. How much more deadly would an arrow be if it were more reliable? If it could be shot from closer range? If the person wielding it didn't require years of training to be effective? By the time his shoulder healed enough for him to return to work, Qin Jue had become obsessed with a radically different idea about weapons. Part 2, The Vision in the Mountain. The problem with bows was simple once you really thought about it. They required strength, training, and an almost supernatural degree of physical development. A man had to practice for years, sometimes from childhood, to become proficient. His arms needed to develop specific muscles. His fingers needed calluses that built up gradually. His coordination between drawing, aiming, and releasing had to become as natural as breathing. And even then, most soldiers were merely adequate with a bow. They were deadly, certainly, but they required an enormous investment of training time. Meanwhile, a new recruit could pick up a spear on his first day and pose a credible threat by the end of the week. Chinjue's insight was revolutionary. What if a weapon could do the work that the archer's body normally performed? What if, instead of a man's muscles pulling the bowstring, a machine did that work? What if the mechanical advantage could be so great that an untrained soldier could fire with the same power as a master archer? What if the pulling and holding of tension could be done by something that didn't tire, didn't shake, didn't require years of physical conditioning? This was the seed of an idea that would grow into something that would reshape human warfare. This was the birth of the crossbow. But Chinjue didn't know that yet. All he knew was that he couldn't stop thinking about it. He began experimenting in the spring of 474 BCE in a small workshop attached to his family home. He carved wood carefully, tested tension, and tried to understand the mathematics of leverage. He didn't have formal training in mathematics, few men in his position did, but he had something equally valuable, the hands-on knowledge of how wood responded to stress, how different types of wood bent and held tension in different ways. His early prototypes were crude and dangerous. The first one exploded when he tried to draw it, shattering into splinters that cut his face and hand. The second one worked, sort of, but launched its bolt with barely more force than a child's toy. He was on his 7th iteration when his father, aging and suspicious, confronted him. "What are you doing?" his father demanded, holding up one of the incomplete mechanisms. Chinjue stood at his workbench surrounded by tools and half-finished designs. He was 30 now. In another generation or two his father's age would reclaim him, and he would be expected to train a son, or lack thereof, in the family trade. Everything in that moment felt precarious. "I'm building something better," Chinjue said. He didn't know how to explain it properly, so he simply told the truth. "The bow is a poor weapon. It requires too much training. If we could create a device that could hold and release tension reliably, any soldier could use it. We could equip armies with ordinary men and give them the power of master archers." His father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "If you're right, every lord in 3 provinces would want what you've created, and every other weaponsmith would want you dead." "Yes," Chinju said. He had already thought about that. His father set down the mechanism and left without another word. But later that week he brought a supply of better wood from the settlement. Unusual, expensive wood that he normally would have hoarded for his best commissions. It was the closest thing to approval Chinjue had ever received from him. By autumn, Chinjue had created a working prototype. It was still crude. The draw weight was uneven. It was difficult to load, requiring 2 hands and considerable strength. But when he fired it at a target of stacked bamboo, the bolt passed clean through 3 sections and buried itself in the earth beyond. He had achieved something remarkable, a weapon that could concentrate power in a way no ordinary bow could manage. He kept it secret from everyone except his father, even after his father died that winter peacefully in his sleep, as if the old man had simply decided he had seen enough of the world. Part 3. The Warlord's Interest. News of exceptional craftsmanship travels slowly but inevitably in small communities. The garrison commander began to notice that Chinjue wasn't delivering his usual quota of ordinary weapons. When asked about this, Chinjue lied smoothly, citing a shortage of good metal, delays in receiving materials, family illness, the usual excuses. But the commander was a practical man named Lord Zhao, neither particularly cruel nor particularly merciful, simply competent. He assigned a soldier to watch the workshop. The soldier reported back within a week. When Lord Zhao arrived at Chinjue's workshop, he came alone. A subtle gesture that Chinjue understood meant either great respect for the craftsman or great confidence in his ability to handle whatever he found. The workshop was neat, carefully organized, with no obvious evidence of the crossbow project. But Lord Zhao was no fool. "Show me," he said simply. Chinjue had rehearsed a dozen deflections, but something in Lord Zhao's manner made him understand that this man would see through any deception. So instead, he walked to a hidden compartment behind his forge and withdrew the crossbow. It was beautiful in its way, a masterwork of wood and iron, representing countless hours of refinement and hundreds of failed experiments. The mechanism was elegant, the stock carved from the hardest wood he could find, the string made from twisted animal sinew, the trigger mechanism incorporating principles of leverage he had discovered through trial and error. Lord Zhao examined it with the careful eye of a man who had spent his entire life around weapons. He didn't speak. He simply held it, felt its weight, sighted down its length, and examined the mechanical systems that controlled the tension and release. "How long did this take you?" he finally asked. 2 years, Qinjue said. "But the next one will be faster, and the one after that faster still. Can you make more than one?" "Eventually, yes. Each one takes time, but—" "Can you make 10? Lord Zhao interrupted. "In a month, perhaps. If I worked—" 20? Qinjue hesitated. To commit to producing 20 crossbows would require help, apprentices, a full workshop reorganized around this single project. It would be impossible to hide from other craftsmen. It would be impossible to hide from the other lords. It would essentially commit him to a path from which there could be no return. "Yes," he said, "but it will take time, and it will change everything." Lord Zhao smiled. It was not a kind smile, but it was the smile of a man who understands that he is standing at the threshold of something significant. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." Part 4. The Transformation. What happened over the next 18 months was, in its way, as revolutionary as the invention of the crossbow itself. Lord Zhao commandeered an entire building at the garrison and instructed Qinjue to transform it into a dedicated manufactory. He recruited other craftsmen, a metalsmith to handle the reinforcements and trigger mechanisms, a carpenter to work the stocks, a specialist in string and sinew. For the first time in his life, Qinjue was no longer working alone in his small workshop. He was managing a project. The first batch of 20 crossbows was crude compared to his handcrafted original. They were built faster, with more compromises, less refinement. Some had mechanical issues, some were unbalanced, but they worked. When Lord Zhao's soldiers trained with them, even the most inexperienced recruits could learn to use them in a matter of days rather than years. The implications were staggering. A peasant conscripted into Lord Zhao's army could receive perhaps a week of training before being sent to battle. In that week he could learn the basic operation of the crossbow well enough to be deadly. An archer, a true archer, trained from youth-needed years. This meant that Lord Zhao could field an army of ordinary men, suddenly made formidable, while his enemies were still relying on the traditional bow with its long training curve. The second batch of 20 was better, the third batch better still. By the 6th batch, Qinjue had refined the design so much that the crossbows rolled off the production line almost as quickly as conventional weapons, and with far more devastating effect. Other lords began to notice. They sent spies. They sent buyers willing to pay extraordinary prices. They sent agents to try to recruit Qinjue away from Lord Zhao. One warlord even sent an assassin, though whether it was to kill Qinjue or merely to disrupt the manufactory was never entirely clear. The assassin was intercepted at the garrison gate and executed. Within 2 years of beginning production, Lord Zhao had amassed an arsenal of over 300 crossbows. His army was suddenly transformed. The balance of power in the region shifted noticeably. Minor skirmishes that neighbouring lords would have won began to go differently. Small fortified positions that should have been vulnerable suddenly proved resilient. The crossbow was changing the nature of conflict. And Qinjue, the son of a common weaponsmith, had become one of the most strategically important men in the province. Part 5. The Great Irony. This was when Qinjue made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was watching soldiers train with his crossbows when he realized something unexpected. The weapon required less courage to use than a traditional bow. An archer faced his enemy, drew the string, saw the moment of release. There was an intimacy to it, almost a physical relationship between the archer and his target. It was terrifying but real. It demanded presence. A crossbow operator simply loaded a bolt, aimed, and pulled a trigger. The mechanical complexity distanced the operator from the reality of what was happening. The bolt simply appeared downrange. The man simply fell. There was no connection between cause and effect in the operator's mind. Qinjue began to see his soldiers using the crossbows with a detachment that troubled him. They began to treat the weapon not as a powerful tool to be respected and feared, but as a commonplace thing. Young men who had never killed anyone suddenly found themselves capable of executing targets 100 paces away, again and again, with no more emotional weight than chopping wood. The casualty rates in battles increased dramatically, not because the crossbows were necessarily more deadly than combined volleys of traditional arrows, but because they could be deployed so rapidly and so thoughtlessly that soldiers never developed the natural fear response that governed traditional warfare. With a bow, a skilled archer could fire perhaps 3 arrows per minute. With a crossbow, a barely trained soldier could fire twice that many. The arithmetic of death had shifted. Qinjue had wanted to create a weapon that would allow ordinary men to defend themselves against professional warriors. What he had actually created was a weapon that made ordinary men devastatingly dangerous to other ordinary men. He had democratized not courage or skill, but the capacity to kill at distance. He tried to explain his concerns to Lord Zhao, but the warlord simply laughed. "You're troubled by your own success," Lord Zhao said. "This is the nature of war. You want to make weapons that kill enemies but not too quickly, with just the right amount of emotional complexity attached. That's not how the world works. The strongest win. The dead are mourned or forgotten. Your crossbows have made me strong, that's all that matters." And Lord Zhao was correct in his way. The crossbows had indeed made him powerful. Within 3 years of the weapon's introduction into his arsenal, he had expanded his territory significantly. He had defeated 3 rival lords, absorbed their holdings, and begun to consolidate a more substantial kingdom from the fractured territories of the spring and autumn period. Qinjue watched this expansion with mixed feelings: pride that his invention was working as intended, horror at the body counts, wonder at the way the entire nature of warfare seemed to be shifting in response to this single innovation. Part 6. The Spread. You cannot keep a revolutionary weapon secret forever. That is a fundamental truth of military history. Spies infiltrated Lord Zhao's manufactory. A crossbow was stolen. Another was purchased at enormous expense through a corrupt soldier. Within 5 years, 3 other regional powers had begun producing their own versions. Some versions were crude copies that barely functioned. Others represented genuine innovations that improved upon Qinjue's original design. A smithy in a neighbouring kingdom developed a lighter, more portable version using a different mechanical principle. A warlord to the south created a variation with a heavier draw weight for penetrating armour. The weapon began to evolve, to diverge, to become something more than Qinjue's original creation. The transformation of warfare accelerated. Armies that had previously been organised around massed spearmen and the shock of cavalry charges began to restructure themselves around concentrated crossbow formations. Fortifications evolved to account for the new threat. Tactics changed, strategies changed. The entire military landscape of the region was reconfigured in response to Qinjue's invention. Historical records become somewhat confused at this point. It's unclear exactly when Qinjue stepped away from the project entirely, but by most accounts, it was sometime around 450 BCE, when he was in his late 50s and had been managing the manufactory for nearly a decade. He had trained apprentices. He had documented his designs. He had, to the best of his ability, ensured that the knowledge would persist regardless of whether he continued to participate. According to historical accounts, he retired to a small monastery in the mountains where he spent his remaining years in relative obscurity, studying philosophy and occasionally teaching younger craftsmen who sought him out. He refused to discuss the crossbow directly, and those who knew him in his later years suggested he had become troubled by the legacy of his invention. He lived to the age of 72, an extraordinary achievement for the time, and died quietly in 425 BCE. His grave was marked with a simple stone, and for several centuries after his death he faded into historical obscurity. Most people, even in his own region, forgot that crossbows had been invented by a man, that there had been a specific moment when someone had looked at the existing technology and imagined something radically different. Part 7. The legacy that changed everything. But the crossbow didn't fade. If anything, its influence only grew. By the time the Han dynasty rose to power 2 centuries after Qinjui's death, the crossbow had become so integrated into Chinese military doctrine that it was difficult to imagine warfare without it. The weapon spread westward, reaching the Mediterranean world around 400 years after its invention. European armies adapted it, refined it, and eventually made it so central to their military strategies that it became the dominant ranged weapon for over 1,000 years. Medieval castles were redesigned with crossbow fire in mind. Medieval armour evolved to protect against crossbow bolts. Entire military doctrines developed around the assumption that armies would be organised around concentrated crossbow fire. The crossbow didn't just change warfare, it changed architecture, economics, social organisation, and the structure of power itself. Kings rose to power because they could field crossbowmen. Fortress designs changed fundamentally. The old system of feudal warriors in heavy armour, the knight on horseback, gradually became obsolete not because of any cultural change, but because a crossbow bolt could punch through the most elaborate armour with frightening ease. The democratization of death that Qinjue had created continued to ripple outward across centuries, and all of this stemmed from one man's injury and his determination to create a weapon that would allow ordinary soldiers to be effective without years of training. Part 8. The question nobody can answer. Here is the profound irony at the heart of Qinjui's story. He created his weapon because he wanted to save lives. This is what he claimed repeatedly in the few historical records we have. By creating a weapon that could be used by ordinary untrained soldiers, he believed he was reducing the overall suffering caused by warfare. No longer would only professionally trained warriors be able to defend their communities. An entire village of conscripts, given a few days of training, could mount an effective defense against raiders. In a very narrow, specific sense, this was true. Smaller communities that previously would have been defenseless against trained warriors could now field effective resistance with the crossbow. But in a larger sense, Qinjue had inadvertently done something else entirely. He had removed one of the natural constraints on warfare, the enormous investment of time required to train soldiers. By eliminating that constraint, he had made war easier to wage. Armies could be conscripted and equipped rapidly. Wars could be started on impulse rather than requiring years of preparation. The total number of soldiers that could be mobilized increased dramatically. The irony is almost perfectly symmetrical. In attempting to create a weapon that would reduce suffering by allowing common people to defend themselves, Qinjue instead created a weapon that made warfare so much more efficient and effective that the total amount of suffering increased immensely. This is not a flaw in Qinjue's thinking. It's a fundamental feature of technological innovation itself. Every significant innovation in weapons technology in human history has resulted in exactly this pattern. Someone creates a new weapon to solve an immediate problem or create an advantage. The weapon works. Both sides adopt it. Warfare becomes more deadly and efficient. The next generation of leaders takes the new level of efficiency for granted and uses it to wage larger, more destructive conflicts. Conclusion. The man who changed everything. Qinjue is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as the inventor of the crossbow. Historians note that he was Chinese, that he lived during the spring and autumn period, and that he developed the basic mechanical principles that would define the weapon for over 1,000 years. Some sources credit other inventors. There is always some historical debate. But most scholars agree that while crossbows may have evolved independently in other cultures, the comprehensive mechanical crossbow that would come to dominate warfare was developed by someone in ancient China during the 5th century BCE. What is less often discussed is the human aspect of this innovation. Qinjue was not a theoretical scientist. He was not a philosopher contemplating the nature of warfare in the abstract. He was a craftsman, a weaponsmith who had been injured, and who began thinking about how to create weapons that would work better. He was a man trying to solve a problem that he understood immediately and personally, and he succeeded in a way that changed human civilization. The crossbow would go on to shape medieval Europe entirely. Castles were built differently because of the crossbow. Infantry tactics evolved because of the crossbow. The decline of feudalism and the rise of centralized nation-states was significantly influenced by the crossbow because it democratized military power and made professional knights less relevant. The very structure of European civilization in many ways was determined by the decisions that Shinjue made in his workshop over 2,000 years ago. And yet, most people have never heard of Shinjue. The weapon is famous. The consequences of the weapon are woven throughout history. But the man himself, the craftsman with the injured shoulder, who spent 2 years creating the first prototype in his small workshop, remains obscure. This is a pattern we see throughout history. Major technological innovations often emerge from individual inventors whose names are forgotten almost immediately. The importance lies in the innovation, not the innovator. History celebrates the crossbow, but forgets the man who invented it. It celebrates electricity, but barely remembers Edison. It celebrates the internet, but has largely forgotten the work of the individuals who created the underlying technologies. Shinjue's story reminds us that history is not made by abstract forces or inevitable technological progress. History is made by individuals' craftsmanship, insight, imagination, and sometimes a bit of luck. A man gets injured. He thinks about a problem differently than others have thought about it before. He spends 2 years experimenting. He creates something that changes the course of human civilization. That's the real story behind one of history's most important weapons. Not an abstract narrative about technological advancement, but the tale of one craftsman who asked himself a simple question: what if there was a better way? And then had the skill and determination to find the answer. The crossbow would go on to kill tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands across the centuries. It would revolutionize warfare, architecture, tactics, and ultimately the structure of human civilization itself. But it all started with one man in a small workshop during the 5th century BCE, thinking about an arrow and wondering if there was a way to make weapons work better. That's the story of the first man to invent the crossbow,